Hi there, I'm Ita Bay with Green River Family Constellations and Sense Thinking, and today I want to talk about boundaries and barriers. Um, and I'll tell it in the context of a little story. So the story is kind of talk a little bit about how these two things are distinct from each other, um, and also similar, and why it's helpful to make a distinction between a boundary and a barrier. So when my son was an infant, up until about 8 years, because it took me about that long, 8 or 9 actually, to figure out what was happening. But up until when he was an infant, he used to get to a point in the evening where he would suddenly he would he would flail, and he would cry, and I just figured he was tired. It was the end of the day. So he'd get really agitated and flailing around, and then eventually he would fall asleep. What happened, instead of it going away as he got older, is that it moved from the end of the day into the middle of the day. And once he started going to preschool, it would happen right after he came home from school. He would get really upset, and he would raging. So it was really intense, really hard for our family. We all felt like we were walking on eggshells. And it took me years to figure out what was going on. I did a constellation at some point, a family constellation at some point, but it was interesting, but it wasn't very useful. It didn't actually result in a shift in his behavior. And what made the difference was food. It turns out he was having a reaction to gluten. And in fact, the very day that I figured it out, or I tested it out, that very day, he stopped raging. Now, this is not a testimonial about diet or anything, although, if that's helpful to you, that'd be great. Maybe a child that is having some difficulty, and maybe gluten can be helpful, removing gluten. But I'm sharing this because I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about boundaries and how to think about that moment from the point of view of a boundary. Let's see if I can find. So I have a piece of paper here. I'm just going to draw a picture. So my son, let's say here's a little circle that represents my son. This little dot right here. And in the case of gluten, he would get super agitated. So I'm going to draw this picture around here that represents his agitation. It would even be sharper, he was so agitated. And what was happening was that in this case, gluten was, the gluten was coming in, and it was really irritating him. And as a child, the way to express the irritation that he was feeling in his system was to kind of rage. And again, the moment we removed the irritation, he calmed down. And so there went this shift in him from being this really agitated state to being calm and at ease and happy. So nice experience there, just right? It was such a gift for us. But what happened was, once we realized it was gluten, we had to make a new rule in the house, a new rule. And at first, we tried to make it for everybody. And so that's what this is. I have this rigid boundary, this rigid barrier around now. And we said, no gluten for anybody. So the wall became very rigid. And we needed to, that time, because we needed our son to heal from the agitation, the disturbance that the gluten was causing to his body. So one way you can think about boundaries then, and the way I talk about boundaries is that a boundary, the function of a boundary is to serve the healthy life force of what it's protecting. And that a healthy boundary is intelligent, it is selective, it moves things in and out, right? Just like a cell membrane, the semi-permeable cell membrane, you probably learned about it in 10th grade, high school. The same kind of intelligence of the cell, that cell membrane is the same intelligence that I want you to think about when you think about a healthy boundary. When something violates that boundary, and it could be something like food in this case, it could be something else though. It could be if you're bitten by a dog, right? That could be that's a real trauma, a violation. And of course it can be much more serious trauma and violations of boundaries. When the boundary is violated, it's a harm. It creates a harm to the system, a trauma to the system usually. And as a result, we often create an alternative to the boundary, which is we create a barrier. And a barrier is much more rigid. It doesn't have the same intelligence as the boundary. It is usually defined by rules rather than a kind of innate intelligence. But you know, we can at times we need both, right? We need a boundary, we need a barrier, we need to know when to go between the two. As parents, when we're raising our children, human children, as you know, the development of a human child is that they require adults. They require parents and caregivers and family and community to care for the boundary of that child, because children, unlike other animals, our human children, they don't exit the mother's womb and then they aren't born into the world with the capacity to be independent beings. They need to be held in a developmental, like a kind of bubble for a while. And so parents have an important role in maintaining a healthy boundary for a child. At different times, right? At different times in the society, that boundary can look more like a kind of intelligence that can be selective. You know, sometimes this is good and sometimes this is bad, right? Sometimes we'll take it in this moment we take it in this moment we let it go, or we leave it out. Or it can know at this age it's not okay, and at this age it is okay. So there is an intelligence that we are bringing into the boundary that we give to our children. A barrier is a little bit different, because barriers, because they're rigid and they're often rule-based, they may also come from trauma. So if there have been trauma to the boundaries of the parents, let's say, or if there's been a trauma to the boundary of the child, or if there's been, trauma in our society, which, as we know, there's plenty of trauma in our society, we may end up creating, rather than lots of intelligent, healthy boundaries, we may end up creating lots and lots of very rigid barriers. So an example could be when children are expected to follow very rigid roles in terms of behavior as a result of whether they're male or female, right? So those can be barriers. So if you're a male and you're interested in expressing a more feminine aspect, or you like to play with dolls or do things that are stereotypically more feminine, a society with rigid barriers between what's masculine and feminine will not permit that, right? And vice versa. If a girl wants to do things that are more typically considered to be masculine, the barriers, not boundary, but barriers will intend to prevent her from doing that. And so barriers that separate people from each other, race-based barriers, for example, a society that and family systems that say, oh, you cannot you can't include those people because of how they look, who they vote for, what their race or religion or etc. is. Those are barriers of exclusion. Barriers of exclusion will bring out in us, in some of us, many of us, a desire for justice. So justice is a very specific thing. In a constellation, when I've worked with justice, the concept of justice in the constellation, what I've learned from that is that justice wants wholeness. That's what justice is. Justice is taking parts that belong together and making them whole, making them belong together again. So healing is the same thing. Healing is taking parts of a system that belong together and bringing them back into wholeness. So when people have been separated by barriers, there will be an impulse towards justice because the system wants to be whole. And so that's all good, right? It's nice to understand that there are times when we may have to have a barrier, like a rule in the house, for example, that says no gluten allowed. And then there are times when once the boundary has healed and we have a healthy, clear, intelligent boundary, we can be more selective and subtle. And so we can bring gluten into the house, but my son won't eat the gluten, for example. So there can be some flexibility now, and we can just work with the intelligence of the boundary. On the other hand, if there's a society that has been establishing barriers between people, we come from a culture that's been establishing rigid barriers, or maybe we've brought up in a family system that has a lot of very rigid rules that are not organic and not sort of don't align with the unique individual expression of the members of the family system, then that will be another place where people will want to break down the barriers. So they become less helpful and healthy, and they become something that people want to move beyond because they want to start to express something that's new, that's part of their own, something that's emerging from their own authentic life force. And of course, again, a boundary serves that. That's what a boundary does. It takes care of my life force. So here's the place where it gets tricky. Sometimes we confuse boundaries and barriers. And we can think that on the one hand, breaking down this barrier is going to be just. But we might, if we're confused about whether it's a barrier or a boundary, we might also try to break through boundaries, which is not justice. It's not justice to break through a healthy boundary. It is a harm. It's a violation to break through a healthy boundary. And if I'm a parent, for example, and I'm responsible for the boundary of a child, and that boundary is violated in any way, I am maybe not consciously, right? But their harm has been caused that needs to be repaired. So I'm offering you a little thought today about the difference between boundaries and barriers, and when you need them, you always need a healthy boundary. And when you don't need them, Now, I said you always need a healthy boundary. I'm just going to say one possible like variation on that, especially as we become more mature and we're responsible for our own boundaries, not our parents. We are adults. Now we're responsible for our own boundaries. And there's also all sorts of ways in which we can be responsible in exploring, well, where are my edges? What can I let in? What do I need to exclude? What keeps me whole? What keeps serving my life force? And I know from my own experience that I have not always been, I feel like I often haven't had the greatest intelligence or really understood the nature of a boundary, of what a healthy boundary is. And so I've often felt for myself that I kind of cross over the boundary and feel where the edge is in order for me to understand, okay, this is the healthy part and that's the unhealthy part. This is how I can tell the difference between what's good for me and what's not good for me. And it's part of our growth, right? Just like it's part of a cell's growth. It's part of our growth to expand our boundaries, to meet our edges. If we want to grow into something new, we will naturally find those edge spaces and expand or include something new to become something new, right? Or let go of things that used to be part of us and that we've changed. People will often say to me, "Oh, Aitabe, you've changed." And part of what's changed is that I often realize, "Oh, I'm holding on to things that don't serve me. I'm going to let them out of my boundary." I find for myself, and I'm curious for you, I find for myself that I feel like I have in general, I have fewer barriers and healthier boundaries, but there are always places where I discover where my boundary is still like something new that I've encountered, and I realize, oh, this doesn't feel good to me. I might need to establish a barrier here for a little while until I figure out how to sort of build the intelligence of my healthy boundary. And so that might be food, for example. I know for me, I often, I started this little talk about food and here I am at the end of it. For me, for example, I'm often trying to figure out what is the best food for this body. And so I go through times where I'm like, okay, this is the rule for this period of time. I'm going to have absolutely no sugar, for example, and no carbs, or whatever the conditions are. And I'm testing that out because I'm trying to figure out, which one of these rules gives me the time to build a healthy boundary. Okay, I hope that gives you something to think about. I'm curious to hear about your boundaries and barriers and how that shows up for you in your life. Take care.